Good evening, class. My name is Danette Shaw. I am a member of Group E, and this is our final presentation on community organizing. The other members in Group E are Shalika Carter, Michael Red, and Erin Walker. The organizing issue that we chose to focus on is increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans.
Thank you, Donette, for that great intro, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time today to hear about our community organizing project. We've been working hard on this, just trying to do our due diligence and gather all the necessary information. But let's dive into this overview. So within this presentation, we are assessing emergency preparedness, right? Emergency preparedness funds particularly for low-income communities within New Orleans that are affected by natural disasters. So obviously, New Orleans is a low-lying city in the state of Louisiana. It is notoriously known for having bad storms, Hurricane Katrina obviously being the most notable, right? With these funds, we're looking to eliminate some of those high risk that these low-income BIPOC populations are seeing within the city because they're at a greater risk, right? A greater risk of losing their homes and not getting them back, a greater risk of not being evacuated property, and then a great risk of not actually receiving proper and adequate resources, right? And so we're looking for the funding to seek to eliminate these risks, right? Because it is a huge risk factor when you're talking about these storms getting progressively worse over time and these communities just still not receiving proper emergency funds so that they can recover well and bounce back from natural disasters. And then we seek to kind of highlight also what other particular resources do they need and where should these funds go, right? Do they need to go to like emergency shelters? Do they need to go to bordering a higher seawall in certain areas? Where do what are the ways that we can properly utilize these resources? Because a lot of times we see funds wasted on things that they necessarily didn't need to go to. So we're looking to assess, right, what else where should we put these funds, right? Like, how do we make sure these are being utilized in the best way? And overall, again, my name being Michael Red, overall, me and my group members are seeking to overall better the communities that are affected by these risk factors so that ultimately, right, they are not put in a position like a lot of people were during Hurricane Katrina where they're just left without anything and no one's actually coming to help them, right? So we're going to dive a little bit more into that, but that's our little brief overview. Don't want to take too much from the rest of my group members.
As we know, New Orleans faces a unique set of challenges when it comes to natural disasters, particularly for its low-income communities. Parishes like Jefferson and St. Bernard are disproportionately impacted by hurricanes and flooding due to high poverty levels. These residents often lack access to essential resources such as property housing, emergency kits, or reliable transportation, leaving them heavily reliant on federal aid. However, FEMA's disaster relief funds are often distributed unequally, with delays and insufficient resources for vulnerable populations. Our project focuses on advocating for increased federal funding to address these inequities, ensuring a fairer distribution and more robust support for low-income communities during these emergencies.
Good afternoon. My name is Shalika Carter, and I am going to speak to you about the purpose of the increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans. Advocating for increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans is to enhance infrastructure resilience, improve community educational resources, and to ensure equitable access to emergency services that safeguard populations during crisis. What are the goals? Number 1, enhancing infrastructure resilience. Strengthen the physical infrastructure such as levees, drainage systems, and emergency shelters to better withstand natural disasters. This reduces the risk of severe damage and ensures quicker recovery times. Next is improving community education and resources. Provide comprehensive education and resources on emergency preparedness. This includes training programs, accessible information on evacuation plans, and distribution of emergency kits to ensure residents are well prepared and informed. And lastly, ensure equitable access to emergency services. Guarantee that low-income communities have equal access to emergency services and support. This involves increasing the availability of medical aid, transportation during evacuations, and post-disaster assistance to ensure no one is left behind during a crisis. Next, we'll look at the objectives. Objectives are very similar to the goals. What are the objectives? Ensuring equitable access to emergency services, improving community education and resources, and enhancing infrastructure resilience, increasing availability of medical aid, developing and implementing comprehensive training programs, and distribute emergency prepared kits to ensure residents are well informed and equipped for emergencies. And lastly, securing the funding to upgrade and maintain levees, drainage systems, and emergency shelters. Lastly, we'll talk about rationale. The rationale for this project stems from the long history of marginalization faced by low-income Black communities in New Orleans, particularly when it comes to emergency preparedness and disaster response. From a Black perspective, addressing these disparities is about more than just safety. It's about racial justice. Black communities often face the compounded effects of poverty, discrimination, and environmental risk, making this an urgent issue. Organizing for increased federal funding not only empowers these residents, but also upholds the values of self-determination and resilience that have always been central to the Black community's fight for equity. By focusing on improving infrastructure, education, and access to emergency services, this project aims to correct past wrongs and better protect these communities in the future. Next, my fellow group member, Donette Shaw, will talk about the key promotional tools. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Shalika Carter, and I am going to speak to you about the purpose of the increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans. Advocating for increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans is to enhance infrastructure resilience, improve community educational resources, and to ensure equitable access to emergency services that safeguard populations during crisis. What are the goals? Number 1,
our key promotional tools, we are using Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook because we thought that this is the easiest way to get the information across to the population that we are working with. On Twitter, we have 3 hashtags: Prepared NOLA, Equity in Disaster, Fund Readiness. On Instagram, we are at Ready NOLA, and on Facebook, we are NOLA Strong. Now we're going to take a look at some demographic information. We chose to focus on these 3 parishes because they were completely devastated by Hurricane Katrina. We see Orleans Parish has the largest population with about 358,000. Of that 358,000, 57% is Black, 32% is white. Median household income is about 56,000, and education level, about 45% of that population who is over 25 have a bachelor's degree, but the vast majority of 72% are white and 27% are Black. And we know that education directly correlates with income. Now we're going to take a look at some demographic information. We chose to focus on these three parishes.
We will now discuss capabilities, the strength of a community. Emergency preparedness is paramount and more common than ever in low-income communities as natural disasters and health emergencies arise. This according to NOLA Ready 2024. New Orleans has always been more likely to be subject to devastating hurricanes and floods. So it is Needs Assessment Project 6, making it more difficult for some of the challenged low-income Black and Brown at-risk residents. Consequently, this also means that these communities struggle even harder to be able to prepare for and respond to emergencies due to lack of resources and infrastructure. This according to Common Ground Relief 2023. But with more funding and a helping hand, local organizations with community trainers are establishing the basic skills to intensify their resilience. This paper shines a light on essential assets found in these communities, such as collaborative networks and access to vital resources that enable the city of New Orleans to emerge safer and stronger from adversity. There are neighborhoods in New Orleans, the lower 9th Ward, for example, where plenty of people live at or below the poverty line. I've done it even better than this. So I'm really showing a lot of moxie when it comes to social work. This is a bottom-up mobilization which has not only built the ownership and empowerment of their community, but has also equipped them to redesign their resilience system in times of crisis or emergencies. Over a wide range of agencies and organizations, the network around Memphis is highly collaborative, something that has advanced emergency preparedness in the region quite rapidly over current systems. For example, NOLA Ready collaborates with organizations like the Catholic Charities and the American Red Cross of the Greater New Orleans. This also according to NOLA Ready 2024. So in the event of a disaster, these partnerships provide an immediate response and services such as food distribution, shelter, medical assistance, etc. Collaboration also entails resource sharing, particularly important in low-income communities where individual adaptive capacity for disaster preparation response is low. Needs Assessment Project 7. Partnerships with organizations like 211 ViaLink are important in providing connectivity to residents needing information and resources. 211 ViaLink is a database-oriented service that connects people to local agencies that provide access to feeding, health, care, housing, and employment assistance. This according to 211 ViaLink 2023. These organizations assist in obtaining information and resources so housing and employment assistance are accessible to these individuals. These organizations also assist in obtaining information and employment so that the community members can effectively deal with the complexities presented by emergencies. Our investments in infrastructure and services through other funded projects via the American Rescue Plan Act are bolstering community-wide resiliency to recovery. So that requires more investment in emergency preparedness because it can build those capabilities, but really help with the resiliency in the long run for low-income communities within New Orleans. These communities bounce back more quickly from crisis because they create empowerment for residents, broaden networks of collaboration, and provide easier pathways to access resources. It is the three-pronged strategy that will build us a sustainable New Orleans that can weather any storm. Thank you. We will now.
The impact of these disasters on low-income communities is staggering. For example, Hurricane Katrina destroyed nearly 4,000 homes in the lower Ninth Ward, a predominantly low-income and Black neighborhood. With rebuilding efforts delayed by years, unfortunately, this pattern of delayed recovery highlights the systemic and structural geographic challenges. Economic disadvantages play a huge role. 24% of New Orleans residents live below the poverty line. These families face prolonged school closures, vacant homes, and workforce disruptions after disasters, making recovery significantly harder. Adding to this difficulty is poor infrastructure. The city is below sea level for geography levels, and the loss of wetlands, which once served as a natural flood barriers, are no longer a viable option. Despite these challenges, programs like the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, one of our partners in this project, are working on improving evacuation logistics and resource distribution for high-risk areas. This way, we can have lasting change and collaboration for a strategic resource allocation, which is essential for building sustainable and equitable emergency response systems.
Thank you, Erin, for that lovely statement on impacts, right? And now we're coming to see what did we learn, right? What did we learn from trying to advocate for emergency preparedness funds for low-income communities in New Orleans, right? Low-income BIPOC communities, to be specific, right? Well, we learned that collaboration is essential, right? Now, not all of us could have went to walk on the grounds of New Orleans and collaborate with local and state politicians, but we used a lot of supplemental information to kind of fill in those gaps and see, all right, what would, if we were working with these individuals, what would it look like, and what would their needs be, right? And just alone for community organization's sake, collaboration is essential, and we learned that, right? Having that boots on the ground approach, door-to-door approach, and walking and talking with community members to see their experiences and to see what has happened in the past and how we can aid that within this emergency preparedness fund is essential. And we're looking at quality data, right? We need to have firsthand data. And that was something that we kind of struggled with because we didn't have a lot of it. Secondhand data is great, but having your own compiled data that is quality kind of helps your organization plan a lot, because essentially you are building a plan in a system with current up-to-date numbers and needs of the community members versus something from a year ago, 5 years ago. Like, these communities are constantly changing, resources are constantly changing. Having that quality data is essential, and then narrowing the scope, right? Emergency preparedness funds for low-income communities, even BIPOC communities in New Orleans, still a little bit broad, but not too broad. And so what we really knew was kind of coming in to this project before it was kind of a statewide scope. It was narrowed down to Louisiana and then narrowed down to specific populations, just because it's kind of hard to do a general overview of an entire state or city. If you want to kind of have a effective community organizing, you have to have kind of a narrow scope in order to have good assessments and implementations for your organization's plans, right? If it's too broad, you spend too much time researching, too much time on trying to make sure everything is right before you can even put things into action. And so these three lessons learned were huge for us, because again, all of these things were kind of some barriers we ran into. And going back to collaboration not only with community members, but with each other, right? Having that we realized how important that was because, if we're not on the same page as organizers, then how can our plan be at all? Thank you. So this is our Garnet chart that we'll be working on, and I'm going to kind of run through the phases of how we broke down this chart to in between all of our group members because this was a collaborative effort. So we kind of gave everybody the roles that they were requesting. And we're going to start with the research phase with Erin Walker. So within this phase, we had Erin review existing literature and identify some case studies just to kind of give us some compilation of qualitative data, and then gathering some quantitative as well on the statistics of how these populations have been dealing with the lack of emergency preparedness funds. This kind of builds up our literature, kind of gets our foot in the door of where we need to track from in order to find our solutions. Then we have Shakayla Carter with the outreach phase of the project with his weeks 2 to 4, and she created a list of stakeholders and developed research materials on it and outreach materials as well for these stakeholders, and attempted to conduct interviews. These interviews, however, weren't able to be had because the stakeholders did not get back to us. So what we did was we kind of did some research on them, kind of filled in the gaps, like, okay, if we were in contact with them, if we were working with them, this is what it would look like, and this is how we kind of feel they would respond again, because, they didn't respond. So kind of filled in our gaps there and kind of used our research phase to kind of help prop this up. And then we have the data analyst phase, which is what I'm heading, Michael Red. Within this week 3 to 5 phase, I analyzed all of the data that was collected and kind of did a little bit of a review, like a check-in, like, all right, what do we have? Is this tracking right? Does this make sense to continue going forward with this? And does this boost our argument, right? How does the data represent the target population and the issues? And then moving into the writing phase, we had done that. She pretty much broke down the parts of the paper, the roles of the paper, and allowed group members to kind of come in and insert, creating that kind of outline, which was turned into a draft, and incorporated some more research findings in it as well. And then the entire team kind of came together and finalized and edited the paper. And that is kind of our breakdown off of the Garnet chart. And yeah, thank you.
Early Sunday morning, Katrina had built into a dangerous Category 5 hurricane barreling towards New Orleans.
On August 29, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast. The world watched as the levees surrounding New Orleans failed, flooding the city, leaving tens of thousands stranded and more than 1,000 dead.
There is absolutely nothing here. We advise people that this city has been destroyed.
Criticism of state and federal officials for the levee failures and botched emergency response was all over the news. But another story was beginning.
We will do what it takes. We will stay as long as it takes to help citizens rebuild their communities and their lives.
I remember thinking we have the best opportunity to rebuild this city as one of the greatest cities in America.
Katrina launched one of the largest housing rebuilding programs in U.S. history, and the outcome has loomed over every disaster since.
This is our Katrina.
But what have we learned?
Now we're going to look at the community organizing framework that we used. We focused on the transformative community organizing, or TCO, and the participatory action research, or PAR. And the TCO model, that sort of focuses on justice, change, and mobilizing the population that is affected, while PAR focuses on recognizing there's a problem, finding the solution and working to address and fighting those systemic oppression that causes the problems to exist. Some challenges and barriers that we had to overcome, specifically as it relates to this project, is that the trust issue due to neglect in these communities was very, very much apparent. The geographic risk of the lower ninth, because it is below sea level. Bureaucratic obstacles and funding. These communities traditionally do not get the funding that they need to renew and replace the infrastructures, and that leads to them suffering when there's a natural disaster. After we were able to build trust, we started focusing on engaging the community and doing the participatory assessment. We did this through focus group discussions. We did surveys and participatory assessments. We did community events where community members shared their experiences. We identified the issues, for example, poor infrastructure and neglect. We had residents acted as co-researchers, sharing goals and intervention. So they got to participate in the process as much as possible, because in the end, this is their community and they are the biggest stakeholders. The key interventions that we used and partnerships that we built, we focused on building collaborative networks. We partnered with Common Ground Relief and Lower Ninth Ward Center for Resource Mobilization. We focused on capacity building and empowerment. We focused on training local disaster response teams. Some resources that we were able to help the community attain are evacuation plans, emergency kit, and communication strategies for vulnerable groups. By far, one of the most important things that we focused on was policy advocacy. We want to put in terms long-term solutions, so that included working with state and local representatives to address some inequities in disaster response system. We also had some community-led strategies to advocate for equitable resources. So now that we've made some headways, we've garnered some resources, we have done some training, we have a disaster plan in place, we've gotten the attention of local and state representatives, and they're buying into investing in infrastructure and disaster preparedness for this community. The next step is that they are going to develop some systems in place to be able to self-sustain these headways that we've made. The way in which they decided to do that is through feedback loop for continuous improvements. They have also come up with community-driven assessments and adjustments, and they also have a plan for adapting to evolving needs and circumstances.
Thank you so much, Donna, for that lovely overview of the framework of organizing. And then we're going to kind of get into now the framing and the reframing, right? And so when we're talking about framing, kind of going back to what we talked about, that narrowing of the scope, what kind of put us in the realm of this community organization project, right? And what were we framing, right? Well, we're framing these three specific topics. So social justice, right? It is a complete injustice for communities to be left vulnerable without education and without resources to something that they cannot control. You have no control over the weather. It's not like somebody can tell the hurricane to stop and go away and go this way, right? Go to Florida. No one can do that, right? And so, because of these lack of funds, it puts them at risk, and no one wants to do anybody. It's not their problem. It's an injustice. These communities should not be left to fend for themselves when they're already lacking resources. It is a social injustice. It is one of the root causes of the framing that we use to kind of build our community organization project, because we realize, look at, all these people that are at risk. It's not just like the fact that they're at risk of losing their homes. They're at risk of losing their lives. Without proper evacuation plans in place, shelters in place, in awareness, warnings, all those things, right? People are at risk of losing their lives when they are not being given the proper resources to recover, because after a storm, it can take days or weeks or even months for areas to recover, lacking clean water, power, and other essential things. Climate change. Secondly, right? Important. The climate is changing. Whether it's for better or for worse is continuously debated. We all know what's really going on. You've seen the movies. We've seen the warning signs, and seems to be checking out. It seems that these storms are going to get progressively worse year in and year out. And with these communities being left vulnerable, you could possibly start seeing more casualties, more damages in the billions, and more lost livelihoods. And so framing the climate change, kind of having that emphasis of something to do with climate, right? These things aren't going to change, and we need to kind of get ahead of the curve, right? We need to get ahead. If we know that storms are getting progressively worse, we need to put emergency preparedness funds in all communities. And then at-risk communities is the last framing, right? We know that there are some communities that don't have these issues. They're far from the seawall. Their homes won't get flooded. And if they do, they're insured and they're covered. They're good. They're fine. But our communities that we're focused on right here, they're not, right? They need the extra help. They need the extra resources. They are at risk and vulnerable. And so framing these things was the specific way we framed our argument, right? Not on here, but one of the ways that we kind of reframed this population was kind of talking about their willpower. Getting through these storms is not easy. The fact that individuals continue to live in these communities despite the risk and because of the lack of opportunities to go elsewhere, they have built strong, tremendous bonds with each other and the ability to, as literal as that sounds, weather the storm, right? These people are extremely strong. When we look at the principles of the Black perspective, we think strength, right? And so that's kind of like me ranting on, but again, going back to these at-risk communities, they're at risk, and that is one of the biggest framing factors, again, that we also chose. So social justice, climate change, and at-risk communities.
Here's the project overview. Our group project increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans, sought to fix the systemic issues that cause lower-income communities in places like Orleans, Jefferson, and St. Bernard to be disproportionately impacted by disasters. Regions most susceptible are where poverty rates are elevated and where such essentials are often not possible to come by during times of crisis. The project aimed to lobby for more federal funding, for a more equitable distribution of the funding, and a better supporting of these communities. The community of interest in organizing problem. The project highlights the importance of this advocacy to secure more funding, to make infrastructure more resilient, to educate and prepare communities, and to ensure adequate access to emergency services. This was motivated by the fact that historically low-income Black communities in New Orleans have been marginalized, especially during disasters such as Hurricane Katrina. The literature that supports. The struggles we encountered are not uncommon in community organizing. Considering this, it is no wonder that fatigue and burnout were abound. In organizing community, emotional and physical labor takes its toll. Strategies that work include ensuring organizers are set up in sustainable ways and in ways that make sure that they will take care of themselves. This emphasis on a need for a momentum and apathy make individuals focus on building communities and being there for the same cause. Purpose and goals. Its principal aim was to promote more federal cash to protect vulnerable populations in times of crisis. The goals included: number 1, building infrastructure resilience, a more solid infrastructure like levees, better drainage systems, and emergency shelters. The community education and resources, improvement, information, and provisions regarding emergency preparedness. Number 3, providing equitable access to emergency services and support to low-income communities, ensuring equitable access to emergency services. Planning and implementing. Planning, resource mobilization, and execution. The initial phase of our project was the planning stage, which included myself, Michael Redd, Donette Shaw, and Aaron Walker. Defining the goals and objectives of the project, we gained clarity using a target status chart and annotated it with tasks, assignments, and timelines. The project manager facilitated these sessions, keeping us organized. Our community liaison organized town hall meetings and focus groups to gather input from residents. The sessions enabled us to get a sense of what the community needed and establish trust. We encountered difficulties in encouraging individuals to participate in these sessions, primarily because of conflicting schedules and a lack of initial interest. To address this, we provided food and child care for participants, which resulted in much fuller attendance. Our community resource advisor reached out to the local businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies for support. We begged for donations of food, cash, and volunteer hours. Challenge 3. Each stakeholder had different timelines and priorities. Our resource advocate ensured everyone was on the same page and committed by using the mixture of regular updates and flexible scheduling. Our logistics guru facilitated the creation of community gardens and a food delivery network. She acquired the land tools and seeds and scheduled volunteer hours for planting and upkeep. We worked with local food banks to establish weekly distribution points for the food distribution network. At this point, food storage and distribution logistics of food storage and distribution was one of the great challenges. Introducing a tracking system to monitor the inventory and facilitate timely deliveries was also the responsibility of our logistics coordinator. Some of the problems we encountered and the solutions we found. During the project, we faced several challenges needing creative solutions. Fatigue and burnout. The degree of workload leads to fatigue among people. So we started to do regular check-ins and encourage people to take breaks. We also rotated roles to prevent the burnout. Community apathy. And the community did not have much energy behind the project at first. We overcame this with good relationships and showed the substantial benefits of the project. Success stories from other communities inspired participants. Coordination among various stakeholders was complicated. We addressed this by ensuring communication lines were clear and that we met regularly to check in. This ensured that everyone was aligned and able to respond to issues quickly. It was a struggle to get enough resources. We also diversified our funding sources and sought out grants to provide additional funds beyond donations. This strategy gave a more secure economic foundation to the initiatives. And in conclusion, our community organizing project was a delicate balance between complexity, challenge, and reward. The project outline and Gantt chart helped to keep things in order. We learned a lot this year and it proved to be a challenge, but we adapted and delivered as a team. The project provided a solution to food insecurity, a sense of community, and a reminder that of the collective power of action. Here's the project overview. Our group project increased emergency preparedness funding for low-income communities in New Orleans.
To address these challenges, our assessment strategy focused on 3 key areas: the needs assessment, process evaluation, and an outcome evaluation. For the needs assessment, we identified community concerns and vulnerabilities, emphasizing on how poverty amplifies disaster risk. By engaging stakeholders, we prioritize actionable steps to address these issues. Our process evaluation involved community mapping to analyze resource distribution and identify gaps post-disaster. Map-based surveys provided additional insights into community dynamics and resource accessibility. Finally, the outcome evaluation collected data to measure the impact of inadequate emergency preparedness funding on these low-income populations. This evaluation included validity testing to assess the effectiveness of our proposed strategies. Our assessment strategy yielded several successes, but also highlighted challenges and gaps. Among the successes, we enhanced community engagement through partnerships with organizations like FEMA, NOLA Ready, and the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. These collaborations allowed us to amplify advocacy efforts using impactful outreach strategies, such as public service announcements, media campaigns, and local networks. Community mapping and surveys provided critical data to identify gaps and vulnerabilities. However, challenges arose. Accessing sufficient funding to implement proposed changes proved to be difficult. Logistical barriers and gaps in data made it harder to create a comprehensive assessment, and some marginalized groups were hesitant to participate due to privacy and stigma concerns. We also identified significant gaps such as inconsistent access to resources for all community members and limited opportunities for interactive engagement and follow-up with stakeholders. These challenges underscore the need for continued advocacy and collaboration to address these disparities to build a more equitable system for low-income communities in New Orleans.
Our next steps are to process what we've learned throughout this process. We have learned that trust is the most important ingredient in community organizing. We've also learned the importance of collaborating with the community and other stakeholders as well. Our next steps are to expand the model to other communities where we'll advocate for sustainable funding.